we are here today to talk about two very wonderful books about Mississippi's rivers. And so while I was prepping for this, I looked at a map, and as near as I can tell, these guys might correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I don't think you can be much farther than 20 miles anywhere in Mississippi from a river of some type. And that's only the big rivers that make it to the map, not the little tributaries and creeks and streams that feed into them, you know. So, you know, as I probably don't need to remind anybody, this week, this is a water state, you know, so it's a fascinating thing to be talking about these books today. So these writers in these books have a lot to tell us about life, you know, in this region, both past and present. And then Boyce has given this epic historical account of the Mississippi River. He's going to say more about just a second, from prehistory to the present. Patrick and Ernest here have created a more intimate, ground-level narrative about the experience of being on the state's navigable water with historical back notes and personal anecdotes. And I have some personal connections to this discussion too. I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. You know, I remember going to the levee and looking at the river, hanging out with my buddies on the weekends and watching the river go by. During 2 summers in college, I actually worked as a deckhand on towboats going up and down the Mississippi River, which was quite an experience, as you can imagine. And recently, not too long ago, I had a chance to paddleboard on the Pearl River with a great guy named Chris Lockhart and his company, Pearl River Kayak Adventures. I would recommend you do that if you ever had a chance to. So let's get started talking about this. I'd like to begin by asking y'all to sort of summarize your books briefly, just in a few minutes, and talk about, you know, what you were trying to achieve for your audience, for your readership.
What do you want to go first? I can start. Yeah, so my book's called The Great River. I think the subtitle captures a lot of what I was trying to do, the making and unmaking of the Mississippi. So I first encountered the Mississippi River 15 years ago. I grew up in New England, but kind of drifted down to the Mississippi Delta and started out as a journalist and got out on the Mississippi River for a magazine story, and sort of did not know how beautiful the Mississippi River was. I had the sense that it was just a giant engineered ditch. And then I found myself in like as beautiful a wilderness as you could find in this country, I think. And that was basically the beginning of an obsession. I just wanted to understand that space and how it came to be and how it persisted and what was going on there. So started writing about that a lot. And then basically people told me, if you want to make any money selling the book, you're gonna have to look at more than just like the Thatcher in the Mississippi Delta. So eventually I was like, okay, let me just try and do this impossible task of figuring out how not just that piece of river that I had got to know, but the whole of the watershed, you know, how has it been altered? How has it been changed? And so that's what this book tries to do. It's 4,000 years of history, and then it's some contemporary journalism looking at, again, how people have viewed the river for centuries and millennia, how they've treated it because of those views, and then ultimately now we're in this state where there's a lot of conflicts because people can't just agree about what the Mississippi River should be, and so try to get on the ground and talk to people in these places where there are conflicts and hear from all these different sides about the river in the future. So.
Thanks.
Well, so 20-something years ago, Ernest wrote Canoeing Mississippi, and it became an instant classic because of his homely, beautiful prose style. And he became sort of a local celebrity because of his writing in the newspaper and because of this series of canoe guides. Well, 20 years passed, and I asked him, why don't you update those books? And during our discussion, we came to the conclusion that nobody wants a canoe guide anymore, because if you want to canoe a river, you jump on the internet and it tells you to put in here and take out there and what you'll see in the middle. But during our discussion of this, I came to find out that he had not really wanted to write a canoe guide in the first place. He wanted to write in his specialty, which is oral histories and stories and homely anecdotes and that sort of thing. So I said, why don't we update this book with the last 20 years worth of your research and will write the book that you always wanted to write, a book of stories and anecdotes and histories and personal tales and outlaws and in-laws and that sort of thing, organized around the navigable rivers, because the rivers are they're the connective tissue, the lifeblood. They are the way that people got into the Mississippi Territory initially, and they influenced the development of commerce, industry, and everything. So that's, I think, the gist of how Paddleways of Mississippi came about.
Ernest, do you want to add to that?
Well, Pat came up with the title, which I like. I haven't heard the word of it. I guess maybe you coined it, Paddleways.
Great, perfect. Boyce, about your book. As we mentioned, it's an epic book. It traces the history of the Mississippi River from prehistory all the way to the present day. So I'm curious to know, how did the scope and the direction of the book change as you researched it and went about putting it together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like it was a slow accumulation to decide. As I said, I at one point I thought I'd write a book of quiet essays about the batch here in the Mississippi Delta, and as I came to decide that I was capable of writing a book as sweeping as this, I had a pretty solid sense of the history of the river at that point, and so kind of knew what had to go in there. I think one big change was the indigenous cultures of Mississippi and just the long history of people living along the Mississippi River and its tributaries down in Louisiana. I knew I was gonna have to deal with that, but I was like, oh, I'll just mention that and move on. But as I spent time with archaeological journals and started to wrestle with some complex questions of have we accurately interpreted what is on the ground here, it sort of revolutionized my thinking of the mounds, as we call them here in Mississippi. They had never meant that much to me, and they came to become, to me, a really important way of understanding what the river is and how we should treat the river and how we should exist with the river. So that was the biggest change. I think that became a kind of frame for the book. I wanted to talk about earthworks, as I call mounds, earthworks as a piece of the past, but also a thing that exists still today and could be a part of the future of the river. The other big challenge was my editor. This was maybe 30% longer when I first wrote it, and my editor was like, that last section, the contemporary journalism, you're gonna have to cut that in half, which was just it was a challenge. It was as hard as writing the book, but it was how do I slim down and talk about what's going on now in just the most succinct way possible.
I want to talk about three particular river systems in the state and on the state of Mississippi, next to the state. First, unsurprisingly, is the Mississippi River. I'm going to start there. Ernest, I know that I'm going to give you this question for y'all because I know you've read the book. I'd like to know, first him and you, what did you take away from Boyce's book about the Mississippi River, and what did you take away from their book about their section of the Mississippi River in Paddleways? Ernest?
Can I stand up? Because I can't see a lot. Can y'all hear? My dad was a preacher anyway. So. My favorite part of his epic sweeping history of the Mississippi River, and this will answer your question, is about the part from where it splits off into the Atchafalaya River. Large part because as a long-time reporter in Macomb, I covered the floods and the speculation that one of these days the Mississippi River will reroute itself down the Atchafalaya, which his book talks about a lot. And it's a fascinating scenario. Who knows if and when it will ever happen. I would say that it will, but I talked to Boyce about this earlier. Who knows when? I mean, it may be centuries. But that was the most fascinating part, is that the spectacle of New Orleans becoming a side thing on the bayou, and Morgan City and Thibodaux being major cities. So that's what I took away.
For me, the thing that was most revelatory was less about the big river and more the chapter about the rivers in the Mississippi Delta. So again, that was my introduction to the river, was living in the Delta, and I think of the Mississippi as being, it's such a big thing. It's not just the line of water that we see on the map. It's all of these tributaries that go into it. It's even the floodplain and the floodplain that's disconnected. These were, so Patrick and Ernest write about a lot of tributaries in the Delta that have been channelized, right, straightened out. And these are rivers that I saw all the time. I spent 9 years in that region driving around, but I paddled a little bit on the Sunflower once, but to get to see those rivers through their eyes from the boat's perspective was underlying kind of what I already knew, but again, how extraordinarily engineered the rural and like vegetative landscape of the Mississippi Delta was really powerful for me.
Excellent. So back to Patrick and Ernest for this next one. My second river is the Pearl River, right here in Jackson. So, what do you think is most distinctive about the Pearl River system, and what should people in this audience and people in the area know about the Pearl?
Pearl River is, the statistics run out of my head, but it's a vast freshwater supply for the people of Mississippi. And it's also a remnant of wilderness, particularly before they built the bridge, where was it? The bridge between Monsanto
Oh, yeah, Gauss.
and Gulls. There was a 50-mile stretch of river wilderness that Ernest describes in this book as like the purest, most beautiful canoeing experience that you could imagine. And even with the bridge,
Between Monticello and Columbia, just for y'all reference.
even with the bridge in there, the paddling experience on the Pearl River is tremendous. I helped with a bunch of Boy Scouts for some years, and of course, when we get ready to do a river trip, you have to run it by all the parents, and all of the parents were universally intimidated by the Pearl River, by the size of it and the potential for alligators and that stuff. So we never got to make a paddle trip with the Scouts on the Pearl, but Ernest has made plenty, like umpteen trips on the Pearl, especially the lower Pearl, which I think is some of his favorite paddling in the world.
On the island swamp, yeah.
Awesome. And one more for you guys, and I'll go back to Boyce. The third is the Pascagoula Rivershed, and this is one I want to proselytize about, because I don't think anybody knows just how important and just what an important river it is for several reasons. But one of you take on that. Why is the Pascagoula so distinctive and important?
So, yeah, the book that I wrote before this is Paddling the Pascagoula, which some of y'all may have heard of. But the Pascagoula was written up in Science magazine a number of years ago as being unique as the last undammed, unchannelized major river system in the lower 48 states. And which is shocking. It was shocking to me. But the map that they had really illustrated, which they showed the Pascagoula basin in green, and all the damn channelized rivers in red. In Canada, there were green rivers, but in entire North America, 48 states, Pascagoula was the only one. That's just incredible. So my friend Scott B. Williams, who's a very prolific author, we co-authored. I like co-authored with Shark Guy. Scott launched his kayak at the upper Chickasahey River. I launched my canoe on the upper Leaf with a friend of mine, Travis Easley. Those are the two main tributaries. And we floated down to Gaucher, Merrill, where they run together, and then on to the coast. It's 200-something miles over a couple of weeks. But anyway, we reported kind of blow by blow what that river system is like because of its uniqueness. So yeah, that's fantastic. There's a lot of public land on it too, wildlife management areas, national forests nearby. There's wilderness, federal wilderness, national wildlife refuge, etc.
Which is a large part of the reason why it's the largest untouched river, right?
And I would just add that it's not just the Pascagoula. We have there's a bunch of tributaries that go into that system, and they're all really beautiful. So
Yeah, it's the major, correct, it's the major canoeing region because of those, like Black Creek and Red Creek and so on. So, yeah.
Awesome. Boyce, here's a big question for you. The subtitle of your book is The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi, which is really what it's all about. I mean, the entire 200 years of messing around with that river. Could you expand on that a little bit and talk about what combination of making and unmaking are we likely to see and should we see on the Mississippi?
in the future, or yeah. I mean, I'll talk first about the phrase "making and unmaking." Is like I think that they are, even though they're antonyms, to me they're synonyms. Everything we've done on the Mississippi, we've sort of been making one river, the river that we America, there's sort of an American mindset about the river, white settler mindset, if you want to use that phrase. And so we've been trying to make that river for 200 years, a controlled river, a river that doesn't flood, a river that's deep enough for navigation. And every act of making is an act of unmaking, because it is unmaking what I think of as the real Mississippi, the Mississippi as it wants to be. It's sort of, it maybe seems too spiritual to think about agency that way, but I think a healthy river has desires that we need to respect. And so that was the idea there, is the last section of the book's called The River Unmade, because it's cataloging how all this work we've done is leading to problems. And so like the work, are you asking like what, to summarize what some of the work is, or
just the overall picture of, how has it gone and how deleterious has it been, and
Sure.
what sort of unintended consequences
Yeah,
are there,
yeah.
and how are we going to proceed? I mean, we can't just go back and undo everything. If we want, if I made you Mississippi River Czar tomorrow, you wouldn't necessarily undo all of the geoengineering that's been done. So how are you?
Yeah.
How do we deal with it? How do we go forward with what we have
I'll try and keep it brief, but
in 5 minutes?
I think it's important to note, like, in some ways what we've done has worked, right? There's $100 billion of cargo being carried on the Mississippi River every year. The Mississippi River and Tributary System, which is the name for the flood control infrastructure here in the South, is 80 years old, and no levee built to the project design height has ever failed. In 2019, the whole Midwest was flooded on the Missouri. We did not flood in the South. But like 90% of the old floodplain is lost and has been turned into a monoculture of corn and soybeans. We've lost a lot of biodiversity through that. We are getting flooding more often because flood control basically makes floods less frequent, but makes them more severe when they arise. We are losing land down in Louisiana, where I live now. There is rampant poverty along the lower Mississippi River, which I think is tied up in this. I've spent a lot of tax dollars building things, and yet somehow the majority of the people that live in the communities that are supposed to be served by these levees are living in poverty, and I think that has to be acknowledged in this. I think the problem is we've built so much that, you can't tear down the levees. I own a home in New Orleans. I lived in the Mississippi Delta for 9 years. They're both places that mean so much to me and would be destroyed if we pulled down the levee. And so it's sort of this slow process of giving whatever we can back to nature where we can. Patrick and I were talking about this before I came in. The big thing to me, if I was a Mississippi River Czar, I would make a lower Mississippi River National Park. I think it is so beautiful, but I don't think most people even here in Mississippi know that. And I think one of the things we need to do to better serve the Mississippi is raise its reputation in the American mind and help more Americans understand that it is not just a giant highway for boats. It is a really beautiful and intact ecosystem, and just having that as part of our picture of this river could be really important for people.
This is a question for everybody. I want to give you a chance to talk about surprises you encountered while researching this book, occurrences that happened, or any sort of thing that stands out to you as you were putting this book together, either in the archives researching it, or out on the river doing something, something that was sort of an interesting surprise to you in the process of doing the book.
Every bend of every river in Mississippi is a surprise. One of my pet favorites is Bayou Pierre. It arises in or around Brookhaven and makes its way to the Mississippi River, almost directly west. And I got the idea that I wanted to canoe this, and reading in Ernest's 20-something-year-old canoe book, it says something about frequent sandbars or very shallow, a lot of head-cutting erosion, that sort of thing. But I wanted to go anyway, so my wife took me to this bridge where I had figured to put in, and it was overgrown on both sides with pepper vine and a jungle of weeds. We finally found a way down into the river. I put my kayak in and waved a triumphal farewell to my wife on the bridge so that she could take fantastic photographs. And about that time, I hit the bottom of the bayou. And for the next, 6 hours, it was alternating of paddling a couple of 100 yards and then portaging a couple of 100 yards. And I said in the book, if anybody ever tells you that they love portaging a canoe, they're lying. But the Bayou Pierre, it is a joy to portage because you see, like, intimately the head-cutting erosion that he was talking about. There were stretches where I was paddling and you could hear the sides of the river calving off and plopping into the river. You could see areas where industrial development on the banks was creating that problem. You could also see, or I could think about, what is the agency that is buying up tracts of Bayou Pierre?
I think it's the Wolf. I'm sorry,
There's a conservation agency that is buying
Mississippi
up.
Outdoor. This, I'm sorry. Can't think of it.
Wildlife Mississippi.
It's the one that, well, it's just slipping my mind. It's the guy in the Delta that started.
Okay, Jamie Cummings.
Yeah, Jamie.
Yeah.
They're attempting to improve the ecological conditions on Bayou Pierre and access to it to make it more paddleable, more of a paddleway. Then you get further down Bayou Pierre, and there are, like, monumental, like the size of this table, chunks of petrified wood and beautiful multicolored clays exposed in the river. It took me quite a while to get, 11 miles down this paddleway, and my wife was stationed at the takeout, waiting for me, doing some fishing. She didn't catch anything that day, but I got to see a lot of, like, firsthand things that we're talking about in this book, from the erosion to the wildlife. Because another little surprise, we're talking about surprises, another surprise that's around each turn. That day, trumpet vine was in bloom, and so it was dropping blossoms into the water to float along with me. So it was a beautiful day of paddling and portaging.
Boyce? Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, this has made me think, not while researching the book, but in June, I went back on the Mississippi as part of my book tour, and the portage thing, I went with John Rusty, who's a well-known canoe guy at Upholt Canoe Company in Clarksdale, and we were in a back channel of the river near, just downstream of Clarksdale, and there's an illegal dam, and so we had to get out and, like, haul this huge 24-foot long canoe, like, put down some logs to roll it up. Yeah, I don't know, this is like counsel. So I canoed from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico, kind of like before I sold the book, but knowing that I wanted to write the book. And there's endless stories I could tell. I mean, the most jarring circumstance in 2019 during that big flood year, John, Rusty, and I got on. We basically surfed the flood crest. We got on the Mississippi River in Baton Rouge just as the flood was coming down and rode into New Orleans. And we should not have done that. It was terrifying. 10-foot waves, baby, like so much water, and then you still have ocean-going freighters. It was crazy, but. Yeah, I think there's like endless stories I could tell. I mean, I think the thing is just the river's another world, right? And I think it's extra true on the Mississippi because down here we have these levees and you go up on this levee and all of a sudden, like you look one way and you see these fields and this very dry terrain, and on the other side you've crossed over into a new domain. But I think it's true on the Pearl, it's true on any river. It's sort of this other world that's left behind, tucked away from, it's the piece that we can't ever really develop or control or fully tame. And hearing Patrick's stories will remind you, you just get out there and any day on almost any river is an incredible experience, will be a memory because you're seeing a side of the world that we miss so much in our daily lives.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask both authors, all three authors, both books, what can ordinary citizens do? People in our audience who hear this and say, you know, I really want to do something to support rivers, to keep them wild and free and untrammeled as much as possible, and leave them there for other people. I want to contribute to helping Mississippi be the river it wants to be, so to speak. What do you think just ordinary folks can do or should do on that behalf?
In a word, float them, see them, look at them, get on them. Because I can think of examples of, well, I'll give you an example. This plan to dam the Pearl in Jackson. Been in the works for years, controversial. And I have a friend who ironically is a paddler, but he's very much in favor of the lake. I live in Liberty, Mississippi, so, okay, whatever. I love rivers, but it's not going to affect me personally. But anyway, he described the stretch of river between Boyce Barnett Reservoir and LaFleur's Bluff State Park as a putrid, stagnant swamp. Well, has anybody floated that stretch? It's the antithesis of that. It's beautiful. And so I told him, I said, look, you need to float it. Well, he did, to his credit. He floated it and was shocked because you lost right below the reservoir at the spillway. Immediately you enter, it's like the Congo. I mean, huge woods, hardwoods, relatively clear water flowing out of Boyce Barnett Reservoir. White sandbars, wildlife, interesting fish. I went with Dr. Don Jackson, the retired fisheries professor at Mississippi State. He'd say, oh yeah, that's a such and such, and that's a such and such on the fish. And there's little sloughs that you can paddle up into the jungle. And it's just an incredible place. And so it's so easy for somebody to say, yeah, that putrid, stagnant swamp, let's flood it, let's dam it, and put subdivisions around it, or whatever, flood control, what have you. But if you go look at the rivers, and you know personally, then you're going to be a whole lot more able to protect them. So that'd be my word. Float them. Get them.
Perfect. Boyce?
You like to get that?
Ernest scooped me because
Me too, so.
I was going to say engage with the rivers and paddle on them. Something that you mentioned about being on the river and a change of pace, like a literal change of pace, because it's easy to like drive over that stretch on I-20 or I-55 and you're going 70 miles an hour and all you pass is a putrid swamp that we should like to do something with so that we can have something nice there to pass by at 70 miles an hour. But it's a good rule of thumb for rivers around here. If you're floating, you're going to be going 1 mile an hour. If you're paddling, you're going to be going 2 miles an hour. If you're really paddling, you're going to be going 3 miles an hour. So.
Except on the Mississippi.
Yeah, on the Mississippi paddle, you can do 8 to 10 miles.
Right. But I have a personal theory that our brains don't work at 70 miles an hour. Our brains work at 1 or 2 miles an hour. So have you ever, like, it's the difference between riding a bicycle around a neighborhood and passing over that neighborhood at 70 miles an hour. The ability to engage with it and understand and see and process and engage with it is vastly improved by actually going out there and slowing down to its pace.
Yeah, and we're obviously well-matched books here because our answers all the same. And I kind of gave my answer at the Lower Mississippi River Park, and to me that's the only thing I would add is like get out there on the river, but then drag everyone else with you. As we need everyone to understand what we have in these rivers, and so it's a matter of the people that already know it bringing more friends so we can build these. Like I am literally like I want someone to start. I don't want to do it. I'll give you the rhetoric, but I want someone to start an actual campaign to make this national park, so that we have people collaborating together to fight for these rivers. And it's that doesn't solve everything, but and recreation is often a selfish relationship with nature, but it's selfish. But then it also means that if people care about beauty, they care about the ecosystem. And so if we can get people fighting for that beauty, we're going to start to get some better answers for these rivers.
Beyond the sort of abstract suggestion of getting out on the rivers, if you want something a little more concrete, maybe you could do a search on the internet for riverkeepers.com, .org, and or Pearl Riverkeepers, and engage with one of these organizations for any of the river systems or any of the river organizations. There's probably a dozen environmental organizations in Mississippi and the South that deal with these rivers. Pearl Riverkeepers we discuss a good deal in this book, but there's a bunch of them.
The cleanup is in 2 weeks.
Excellent.
There's a cleanup on the 28th on the Pearl River, if people didn't know.
All right, so this is a little bit silly. But before I turn it over for audience questions for these three, I've got to ask these guys one thing. If you've read Paddleways, you know that it's this fascinating combination of pure instructional information. If you want to paddle this creek, you should go to this landing, you can do this, you can get off 10 miles. There's also this layer of beautiful lyrical description of the wildlife and the landscapes and the sky and the water and all that sort of thing. And then there are these personal stories for each of them where they talk about a day that they spent on this part of the river. And so I spent a good deal of time wondering who was who in the book and who was writing about which part. But there's one sentence I have to ask you guys about, and I've got to know if this is intentional because it's so quietly done, and if so, who wrote it? And this is the sentence. David L. Pugh of Waynesboro had been working at a funeral home for nearly 30 years and serving as Wayne County coroner for 12, and he was feeling buried by work.
That was me.
But so, but beyond that, did you guys both do all of that, or was there some of it that was more Ernest and more Pat?
That is a perfect example of what I first mentioned about Ernest's style that has made him a joy in the Southwest Mississippi community. And a joy to work with.
So that was you. That was yours. Did y'all chuckle over when it was in process?
I did.
Just slipped by it real quietly. So I had to ask that.
Well, the way, in a nutshell, that we did it was I would start with the basics, and I relied heavily on Canoeing Mississippi, Paddling Pascagoula, and the GM newspaper articles I've done, and use that as the foundation. And then, like you said, I would add a whole lot that I've done since then, and then I would email it to Pat, who was right up the road, and then he would add incredible amount of information. It's like, where did you get this? But he did heavy-duty research in addition to his own personal experiences. an example of one of his contributions is Civil War history. I knew a little bit about Civil War history on the rivers, like the Battle of Big Black, and of course the Siege of Vicksburg. But Pat really went into a lot of fascinating, not just boring history, but fascinating anecdotes from the Civil War.
There's, I think, a lot more than just the beavers and the birds will be lost if, for instance, you flood the Lower Pearl to make a lake. You'll lose a lot of the history. Have any of y'all heard of a place called Mule Jail? Yeah. That would be lost if you flooded that region. How about the Civil War internment camp at the burned bridge on Pearl? That would be gone. Well, it's gone, but that would be further gone, submerged. So I think we tried to make this book a engaging, anecdotal, sort of homely style of instruction and description, and we've done the best that we can. I think Ernest did a great job.
That's how you both did. Thanks. All right, so we can open it up for questions from the audience now. Yes.
When you said there was one sentence, Ernest said, "I bet I know what sentence you're talking about." Clearly, it wasn't the one he was asking you about. What?
No, I was, I'm glad you didn't read it. There's the sentence in there, what is it that the general on this camp, a Civil War general, traveled 88,000 miles to his destination to the battle? And we were asked about this. It was already in print. And I'm like, what? And of course, Pat did the Civil War stuff. But he looked back at the manuscript that was not in our manuscript. And that's the kind of things happen in books.
Yeah.
Somehow. And I said, well, he must have sailed around the world a few times.
Right?
Thanks for not reading that.
He went with Captain Cook around the.
Yeah, we had no idea how 80,000 miles got into the manuscript because I looked back and sent the guy that was asking about that the manuscript, and it said 600 miles. So
Can you tell us again the magazine that had the article regarding the passage through the river?
It was a book, Paddling the Pascagoula, published Paddling.
The Science magazine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. It's in, Science magazine, and it was, I guess, in the 90s.
And that's the name of it, the science.
It's called Science. Yes, ma'am.
So,
How much of the shadow of 1927 are we still living in?
It's a good, so yeah, I think most people would probably know the 1927 flood, right? Very large flood. I kind of often call it the Katrina of the day. It was national news. It shaped the presidential election afterwards. Rising Tide is the great book about it. I mean, the engineering that we have on the lower Mississippi River was the solution from the 1927 flood, right? We had only built levees before the flood. Now we built even bigger levees, but I sort of think of it as the moment that the Army Corps of Engineers decided to really make the Mississippi River into a machine. We have gates that can open and close. We've got, revetment. We've got all these wing dams. And so reservoirs, yeah, not on the lower Mississippi River, but on many of the tributaries, including tributaries right there in the Delta. So it is, it's for 100 years it shaped the way we've treated the Mississippi River. I think it's interesting, like a lot of people think in the 1927 flood because afterwards, the U.S. gave up this idea of levees only policy, and they were like, oh, we have to give the river room. And you can frame that as being like, oh, we wised up. We understood that ecology mattered, but I think it was just a doubling down in some ways of like, we need to tame and control this river. I think there are small changes now. I mean, the Army Corps, there's a policy memo that's saying that in any analysis of a project, they need to consider green infrastructure as one of the potential solutions and compare that equally side by side to other proposals. So I think we're starting to recognize we can make even larger changes that regard the ecosystems more.
questions. Yes, ma'am.
So, Boyce, I have a question about river culture and people who are drawn to rivers and maybe what rivers do to people. Did you find in your research that there were certain people who were just drawn to either live around the Mississippi River, drawn to the lure of the river, and as a result, what did the river do to them?
Sorry, that was.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. I mean, basically, the question was river culture, right? Is there a certain kind of people, or like how does the river draw people? And I mean, yes, I dealt with it in the book. There's I kind of sprinkle it throughout the book, the travelogues of people through the years and how those have shifted and changed. I talked a lot about what are known as shanty boats. So this was started in like the 1880s on and off through the 1930s. Maybe people built rustic houseboats and floated down the river. I mean, it also, I mean, I am a river person, right? So I couldn't avoid it. I stumbled onto this river as a 25-year-old and haven't left for 15 years. Go to all these river towns, and there's something, I've never really been able to articulate it well, but there is something about a river town. You go to Rosedale, Mississippi, and it's pretty down its luck, but there's just something there. I lived in Cleveland, Mississippi for a long time, but then I go to Rosedale, and there's just this like funk from the river that I really love. It's been clear to me, even being on tour for this book, just tons of people, they don't know who I am, but they know what the Mississippi River is and want to come out and talk about it. And so, yeah, I don't know what it is, but I think there is something. I mean, there's another great book that came out a couple of years back called Riverman by Ben McGrath. It's about a guy who spent his life wandering North American rivers. And Ben writes about how rivers are, in a rural place, it's the most cosmopolitan place you can be, because you can stand on that bank and know, if you're in New Madrid, Missouri, stand there and you're connected to New Orleans. But then in New Orleans, I did this over the weekend, it's the most rural and wild place. You can go walk over the levee and get a batcher, which is what we call the land between the levees, and be in a wild place. And so it's sort of perpetually the other space, no matter where you are, and I think that is a draw for a lot of people.
My question ties into that. So I grew up in the Cold Bluff community, right there on the Coral River in Cold Bluff National the state park. And so I spent a lot of time like on the river with friends growing up, and it was just this vibe that it was kind of for certain people, but certain of my friends weren't comfortable going there. And now as I do like a lot of like youth leadership programming and things like that, I work with BSA, there's a lot of push to diversify the woods and the camping experience. But I don't exactly see that same vibe or momentum for the canoeing and paddling experience, because I grew up kayaking a lot. And I'll see parents be like, yeah, I think you can go hiking and camping, but when I talk about taking you to the Knoxville Refuge and putting some boats in, they get very anxious about that, regardless of who's there. And this is a lake, this isn't a river. So what can you kind of do to build the bridge, for lack of a better word, to kind of help diversify our waterways? Because that's how conservation happens, right? Is make it important to everyone. So.
Patrick, you talk about Chris more?
Oh, sure. Well, again, I have to talk about Chris Lockhart, who grew up in a poorer neighborhood of Jackson, Mississippi, and unlike many of his peers, went to Mississippi State, learned wildlife biology, and came back and founded this kayak adventure company on the Pearl River. And I was amazed when I first learned about him, because I was looking on Facebook and on his posts and everything, and I saw that almost all of his customers, clients paddling on the river were African American, and I thought, well, this is a great thing to be going on, because it's not historically been how it's been in the outdoor space. And so he's a great example of how it can happen, and I just want to say that it's there and it's happening. And so,
I mean, like John Rusky, who I mentioned earlier, in Clarksdale, one of his big things is to get the youth of Clarksdale out, and he runs summer camps, works with charter schools in Clarksdale and Helena, Arkansas. So there are these efforts. I mean, I think and the history of the river is interesting to me too, because I think the river historically was a black space, right? In the slavery era, it was the safest place, so that's where runaways went. But also, the violence and trauma of that era now, I think, leaves descendants of people feeling not comfortable in that space. But I don't have a good answer, but there are people doing that work, and I think it's sort of reclaiming that story and helping. We need to tell the story of the Black history of the river more, because it matters, and I think can help people connect.
Tell the story, keep inviting people.
Yeah.
Just keep being like, oh, it's great, come.
thank you. I have some hands back in the back. Well, that I want to make sure I get. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to ask, and this is for everybody on the panel. It seems like the majority of the kind of affinity is towards the canoe for like chosen paddle vessel in this age of like more modern. There's like, I think one of you maybe mentioned like a paddle board, and then we've got all those kayaks, but it seems like some of you keep coming back to the canoe, and I was wondering why that affinity. Is it nostalgia, practicality, or is there some romantic idealism caught up in it?
So why the affinity for the canoe? I think this guy might want to take that one.
Well, nostalgia suggests something in the past. For me, that was the way we did it. I'm a little older, I guess. Kayaks were newfangled, not literally, Eskimos were doing it, but in use for recreation. Not many people were kayaking. In fact, virtually nobody was. Never heard of paddleboard until recent years. But aside from that, the canoe is the obvious superior.
I mean, I will say, I'm spoiled for, I want to go backpacking, but I can't do it because when we go canoe camping, it's like, let's throw in the Dutch oven and all this food, like 3 coolers, and you can't have a kayak, but I haven't taken it overnight because you just can't pack it the same way. So I think that's part of it, is like, some of these rivers, you got to do overnight trips to really experience them, and you have a much easier time on an overnight trip with all of that space in the canoe. Yeah.
Or a month.
Yeah.
And it's you sit down like sitting in a chair as opposed to sliding in. Now, I'm sure a lot of y'all are kayakers, no offense. But my buddy Scott B. Williams is a sea kayaker, and when we did paddling the Pascagoula, he took a sea kayak, I took a canoe, and we had an ongoing humorous debate about which was superior. So, but yeah, it's just the best.
I think there is also this. John Rusky, again, I keep bringing him up, but like he's devoted to the canoes, and he built a Voyager style canoe, which is like a throwback to French fur traders, but he sort of sees it as a technology that was perfected on the Mississippi River and was perfected, right? It's historically important on these rivers, and it is a vessel that serves its function still today. So
It occurs to me, Boyce, I heard a question just now. It's John's website is Quapaw Canoe Company, is that right?
And then there's the Lower Mississippi River Foundation, and that's the nonprofit wing that does the work with youth largely. So yeah.
If you don't know him, he's worth looking up. Just follow him and be inspired by him, and maybe support him directly. I think would be a pretty good idea. So, yes, sir.
Maybe a stupid question. What's the difference between a creek and a river? Or is there a point of difference?
It's definitely on my mind.
The question,
What's the difference between a creek and a river?
Mississippi has a legal definition of what is a navigable river, and when you set out to do a book about the rivers of Mississippi, there's like a nebulous place. Where do you cut it off? Why don't we put Topsaw Creek in there? Why don't we put this and that? Why do we do that? But at some point, you have to stop writing chapters for a book. The guy in the previous panel was talking about that. At some point, you have to stop chasing rabbits and publish them. But so what we took as our cutoff point was the legal definition of navigable, which back in the day was something about you have to be able to float 100 bales of cotton 9 months of the year, 25 miles on the thing. That sort of
says something about what our past economy. That's what
right.
Also, you got to add in like boats and bayous too. Those are part of the classification that remain navigable.
Right.
Well, we were asked this when our editor wanted to know why we referred to Bowie River and Bowie Creek. And some, you can say, well, when it joins with the Okotomo, it becomes a river. Up until before that is creek. However, it's used interchangeably. So there is no clear definition at all. In fact, Bayou Pierre is really a creek. So those are just.
Share a seat back in the back if anyone has a question back there to ask. Yes.
So I'm a hydrologist for the Corps of Engineers, and love the Great River. I've been recommending it to so many of my colleagues, and I think it really captures this like zeitgeist that you mentioned about looking at nature-based solutions and kind of reframing what we do. But one thing I'm thinking about is like people's relationship to risk. And you said on the Inside Out podcast that like the core is not the villain in the story. The core is like enacting people's desire to have flood control and to like, I don't know, benefits we get from that disconnection. So if you're making an argument for reconnecting floodplains, you also have to ask people to like reshape their relationship to that risk. So I'm just curious how you guys think about flood risk and if you have any advice for like reshaping culture around flood risk.
I don't know if I have advice for reshaping culture. I mean, I think that's, again, I'm more and more thinking about how like flood control, again, often like flood control infrastructure tends to decrease the frequency but increase the severity, right? It's like 300 years ago, the Mississippi River, all of the delta flooded every year, maybe a foot or two deep, and like a lot of the ridges would stay above it, but that was not tenable for the kind of society that the United States of America wanted to make. And so we had to make that happen less often, but then whenever the levees do fail, and I think something, again, decades, centuries, it's just a long fight against a river that's not going away. So if something does happen, it becomes more severe. I think this is the beginning of an answer, concept of a plan, perhaps. There's a lot of talk out west about traditional ecological knowledge around wildfires, where land managers are starting to realize indigenous people had set prescribed burns, and they said, let's do this ourselves, and that prevents these big fires from happening. And finally, managers and agencies are saying, well, we better talk to those people and like reincorporate that practice. And I think it's time for start discussions of traditional ecological knowledge of flooding, which I think is basically the same thing. Of like, again, you find ways to allow low-level flooding to occur and exist with it so that you don't have to have the big floods. Like, again, it's the concepts of a plan, because it's a very, like, how do you do that? It gets really complicated, but it is thinking about how do we build cities that are sponges and cities that store water. How do we build homes in ways that allow water to exist there and come in and out? And how do we have more spaces that are amphibious in those ways? But it's going to have to be this cultural shift of embracing that concept.
Yes.
Boyce, I was wondering if you could talk more on how your thinking was revolutionized around mounds that you mentioned earlier, and how we should treat and work with the rivers.
Yeah, so you think that was like I mentioned earlier, like how important mounds or earthworks became to me, and these questions like what changed. It's like there's a sequence to this. So Cahokia is the most famous mound site potentially. It's across the river from St. Louis, 1,000 years old, 100-foot tall mound. It was a city. It was a city in prehistoric North America, which most people don't think of indigenous North America as being an urban culture, but it was. But when I first learned about Cahokia, a lot of the stories that are available, most accessible to a popular audience, emphasize how Cahokia was a violent place and a place with a lot of inequality. It was sort of, in some ways, the birth. I don't know, when I first learned about it, I wrote an essay years ago that was sort of like a despairing essay, because I was like, this is, when I go out on the Mississippi to avoid all the inequality and the problems of contemporary American society, and then there's one version of the Cahokia story that's like, well, even 1,000 years ago, indigenous people were repeating all these same problems. What changed for me is I got deeper, and I think that there are mounds that go back many thousands of years before Cahokia that were as important. They were built before agriculture, they were built by egalitarian societies, and so I came to look at them as things that were built by people finding ways to work together and finding ways to work together as a community and working with nature and kind of acknowledging, that the river is not an easy place to live. It's a dangerous place, but if we pool our labor together, then we can all survive in this difficult place. That to me is the story I read in the earthworks. I think I get that from reading and listening to indigenous people, but that's my version, and you should talk to the actual people who can interpret this as being from their ancestors. But I think, again, it's partly an economic thing, it's partly a spiritual thing, but it's the sense of we can't treat this system as something to extract from. That tends to help a few people and not everyone and not the ecosystem. And the earthworks teach me of like, collaborate, work together. It's a perilous world we live in. Let's help everyone and everything, human and non-human, survive. That's kind of what I got from those indigenous cultures. And I think the other thing is, a lot of that has been lost directly on the Mississippi River because of Indian removal, things like that, but there's still a very strong indigenous presence in Louisiana, and then also in Minnesota, interestingly, the top and bottom of the river. And so these are groups that are doing important work, and so if we listen to them, that's a piece of the stuff.
So we have time for one more question, but I do want to say that at 12:15, all of us, including me with my 2 books, will be at the signing table.
Tell them what your books are in case they haven't read.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then we won't have time for one more question. But I've written 2 biographies. The first is called The Window to Heaven. It's a story of an Episcopal priest and missionary who graduated from Swanning in Tennessee in 1892, went off to Alaska, and his party was the first to summit Denali in 1913. Also, ferocious advocate for Alaska Native rights. It's a fascinating story to tell. And my second book, Nature's Messenger, is about the British naturalist Mark Catesby, 18th century artist, naturalist, explorer, who came to South Carolina in 1722, went back to his native England and produced the very first gorgeous, magnificent illustrated book of North American plants and animals. So those will be available at 12, but we'll all be there at 12:15. And if you have more questions you didn't get time for today, I hope you will come see us all then. And I think we're done.
Can I give my Southlands plug?
Yes.
Because I think this is right now. So I'm trying to figure out what comes next and various things, but one thing I really want to do is launch a print magazine about nature in the South. So I cover hunting, fishing, paddling, backpacking. I think that there are all these beautiful magazines about out west and not about down here. And I think, again, this discussion of remembering that these places exist, I think that there's so much natural beauty in the South and we don't always celebrate that. So putting it out there, I'm looking for collaborators, supporters. I figured people in this audience would be down for that project, so I wanted people to know about it.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.